Okay, we'll get going. Sorry we're a little late here. I'd like to, in general, aim to start on time. So, in any case, the Strawson article is one of the real landmark essays in contemporary philosophy. One of the most influential and important essays, I think, on free will and moral responsibility. I guess it's mostly on moral responsibility and not too much on free will. So last time, we kind of started with a presupposition that moral responsibility requires control or freedom, and traditionally and frequently, that kind of freedom is understood as freedom to do otherwise, the kind of freedom that corresponds to the picture of the future as a garden of forking paths. And then we looked at some challenges, some skeptical challenges to the idea that we have that kind of freedom. After all, we typically don't or shouldn't think that we know for sure that causal determinism is false. It may, epistemically, it may well be true. Most physicists, I suppose physicists themselves may not really have a view on this. Physicists and philosophers of science who reflect on this, perhaps most of them think quantum mechanics shows that there are irreducible, ineliminable indeterminacies at the basic level, and that those indeterminacies don't all cancel out at the macro level. On the other hand, there is a substantial number of physicists who are withholding judgment, and theorists of physics, philosophers of science, and some who actually believe, following Bohm, B-O-H-M, that quantum mechanics can be interpreted or ought to be interpreted in a deterministic way. We don't really know whether determinism is true. And presumably we don't know whether God exists. Many people are atheists, but perhaps many people would say, I'm not absolutely sure God doesn't exist. And it turns out that there are very powerful and structurally similar arguments from, let's say, the existence of an essentially omniscient God, or from causal determinism to the conclusion that we're not free in the relevant sense, that we're not free to do otherwise. So under these circumstances, we can't really be confident in our status as morally responsible agents and persons in a robust sense, interestingly different from animals. Now there are all sorts of debates, and we can go back and forth about the consequence argument, and the structurally similar arguments with regard to God's foreknowledge and fatalism. But what Strawson offers is a certain way around, or a way of sidestepping these ancient metaphysical disputes and contemporary disputes even about the consequence argument. Basically what he says is it's a mistake to think that moral responsibility requires some antecedent, as it were, or independent condition to be satisfied, specifically a condition of freedom. So we've been presupposing that responsibility requires freedom to do otherwise, but that's really what got us into trouble, you could say, according to Strawson. It's not just that moral responsibility doesn't require freedom to do otherwise, it doesn't require any independent, the satisfaction of any condition of freedom at all. Okay, so roughly speaking, according to Strawson, and I'm just gonna summarize and present some of the main points, and we can stop along the way. That may be the best way to do it, but there'll be plenty of time to discuss. So this is really the first strategy we're going to look at for dealing with the consequence argument. He wants to say that the very presupposition that responsibility requires freedom is problematic. Our practices of holding people responsible, that is, targeting ourselves and others with the reactive attitudes and practices like punishment and reward that express those reactive attitudes. These practices just are moral responsibility, and it's a mistake to seek to step outside the practices and justify them by some independent condition. That's a mistake, and in fact, I think he thinks it's related to or a special case of the general mistake of thinking that you can step out of an entire framework and somehow justify the entire framework. You can, of course, within a conceptual framework of any kind, here we're talking about responsibility practice, but within, you could be thinking of epistemic practices or epistemology or whatever. Within those kinds of contexts, you have a framework. You can call into question parts of the framework by invoking other parts of the framework. But what you can't do, and this is kind of roughly a Wittgensteinian point, you can't step outside of the whole framework and somehow expect to justify it. Justification always occurs within, or internal. And so what Strawson is basically saying is responsibility, our framework of responsibility is this set of practices involving targeting ourselves and others with the reactive attitudes like indignation, resentment, respect, gratitude, love, hatred. Okay, so that's just what moral responsibility is, moral praise and blame. You could add punishment as, I think punishment and moral reward are ways of expressing the reactive attitude. So I think punishment is a symbolic expression of indignation on the part of the state. In any case, this is what our framework of responsibility is, and it's a mistake, just as in general it's a mistake to think you can step out of your entire framework and justify it from outside. It's a mistake to step out of the framework of responsibility practices and look for some independent justification in terms of a metaphysical condition being satisfied, specifically a condition of freedom. This is a so-called normative approach to responsibility rather than a metaphysical. This distinction you see a bit, matter of fact, lamentably you see it often, the distinction between a metaphysical and a normative view about responsibility. But I claim that it's very, very vague and unclear what that distinction really amounts to. And at least it's true that different people use it differently. And different philosophers who are classified, let's say, as adopting a normative notion of responsibility are adopting a normative approach in different ways. I mean, it's important to see that. But one way of thinking about Strawson's kind of normative approach is this. He's giving an account of moral responsibility that doesn't involve a condition that is a metaphysical condition, a freedom condition. What he does say, think of him this way. Responsibility, again, as I said, being morally responsible is being an apt or appropriate or fitting target for the reactive attitudes. But on a more metaphysical view, you would say, all right, in order to be an apt target or a fitting target of the reactive attitudes, you have to meet a freedom condition. You have to be free to do otherwise, or you have to meet some freedom condition. According to Strawson, though, to be an apt target of the reactive attitudes is to exhibit an appropriate or suitable quality of will. So for you to be an apt target of my resentment, you must show me hostility or indifference. And in order, of course, for you to be an apt target for respect, or not respect, but let's say gratitude, you have to have shown me a good quality of will, a benevolent quality of will. So aptness is correlated with or fits with quality of will, but not with some metaphysical notion of freedom. So it's a normative conception. It's focusing on goodness and badness and indifference of the will, and it's focusing on these practices of targeting ourselves and each other with these specific kinds of attitudes like gratitude and resentment, but not requiring any prior metaphysical grounding. So in that sense, it's kind of clear what is meant by a normative rather than a metaphysical conception of responsibility.
Yeah. So, in in another version of the chapter that we read in the last, so the first chapter of Responsibility and Control, the book that John wrote with Mark Revisa, there's a very similar essay that you wrote for Perspectives on Moral Responsibility.
Yeah, so there was an anthology that Mark Revisa and I edited with Cornell Press, 1993, called Perspectives on Moral Responsibility. And in the introductory essay, we tried to interpret Strawson's account a bit. Yeah,
yeah, right. And you push this as a criticism. The criticism goes something like, on Strawson's view, being responsible just comes to being targeted by the negative reactive attitude. So it's open to this criticism that the practices themselves aren't accessible. There's no theoretical claim about responsibility or free will to which the reactive attitudes answer. It looks like if you have the reactive attitudes towards somebody, that person's blameworthy. But that's weird because we can imagine cases in which it's inappropriate to blame somebody. And so the suggestion was, and a lot of people I think have felt that that's a pretty apt criticism.
Yeah.
But I've always thought that there is a kind of implicit, maybe not a free will component to Strawson's view, but an implicit control condition insofar as you express ill will through your behavior only if you have, presumably only if you have a certain kind of control. Right. And what Strawson's excusing conditions often do is show that that control wasn't present, so your action didn't express ill will, so it would be inappropriate to blame you, to target you with resentment. So sometimes I've thought that criticism is pushed a little too quickly against Strawson.
Well, that's interesting. So we'll have to think more about that. That's an interesting worry, and it would apply to what I just said as well. And I'll get to you in just a sec. So, in other words, when you read this essay, as you've done, and reread it, you'll see that he tends to talk about moral responsibility as the practice of targeting ourselves and others with the reactive attitudes. And so being a morally responsible agent is nothing more than being the target of the reactive attitudes in a culture. And you could have different cultures with different practices, but relative to a culture, being responsible just is being an actual target of these attitudes. And what we thought, Revisa and I, was that this then, right, as Matt says, doesn't leave any room for criticism of the practice, or, you know, if a culture actually targets people who are severely mentally retarded or cognitively impaired, or with severe Alzheimer's with reactive attitudes, we want to say there's something problematic about it, but it didn't seem that the Strawsonian view, interpreted in the strong way that we did, leaves any room for that. Now, so that's why I think it's a bit more felicitous, more charitable to interpret him as saying something like, moral responsibility is not the actual targeting so much as the aptness of the targeting. So, but what distinguishes then a Strawsonian, a more normative conception from a more metaphysical conception would be how you specify what the aptness requires. And on a metaphysical view, the aptness requires a kind of control, so that someone with Alzheimer's or someone with severe mental disorders that impair their executive capacities wouldn't have that control. But on a Strawsonian picture, the aptness is not explicitly put in terms of control, it's put in terms of quality of will. So that's what makes it, I mean, it's inappropriate to feel resentment against someone who doesn't really show you ill will or indifference. Well, what Matt is suggesting is maybe you can draw these two, the control and the quality of will views together, if you think that having a certain kind of quality of will conceptually requires a certain kind of control, that you couldn't really show me ill will unless you had a kind of control. Well, that would bring them together. I think, at least, I mean, if that is his view, it's not really explicit. And so it's something we can keep in mind as a possibility. Okay, Sophia?
Yeah, I just had a short question. Do you think it's possible to have a purely metaphysical approach? Because it seems to me that the conclusion that persons in this kind of situation or this kind of agent can't be morally responsible, that's a moral conclusion, so you should have some kind of moral premise to draw it, not just metaphysics.
Okay, so this is really complicated. One thing I should just say.
I said a short question.
Yeah, no. But short questions might not have short answers. So this is, I do write about this in my book, Deep Control, and in one of the chapters I try and give an account of the distinction between metaphysical and normative, or point out some of the problems with some ways of drawing the distinction. But one thing to start with is, you might say, well, moral responsibility is obviously a normative notion. I mean, it's the concept, it's a certain concept that's essentially normative, so what's the issue? As in the reading for yesterday, I distinguished, Mark Revisa and I distinguished the concept of responsibility from particular conceptions of responsibility. So conceptions of responsibility give the truth conditions for the application of the concept. Just like in Rawls, John Rawls, The Theory of Justice, distinguished the concept of justice, which all the different proponents, or all the different participants in debates about distributive justice have in common or share, and then they offer different specific conceptions of it. So there's a utilitarian conception, a perfectionist conception, a Marxist conception, a liberal democratic conception. But they're all talking about the same thing as specified by, or trying to give an account of the application of a certain concept, the concept that they share. Well, there's a similar distinction in moral responsibility theory. So you might, the different ideas about the concept of responsibility I talked about last time, the Strawsonian aptness for the reactive attitudes concept, or the ledger concept, or the accountability concept. Those are all ways of trying to specify this thing we all have in common, that when we're debating about responsibility. But the conceptions then are the conditions of application. So let's say we have the Strawsonian concept, then you could still ask, well, does it require freedom to do otherwise? Does it require indeterminism? And so forth. So those would be theories of when the concept is applicable. So what I would say is, yes, it's obvious that the concept of moral responsibility is normative, but the debate is about the conditions of application of that concept. So when someone says, S is morally responsible if and only if, and then fills in conditions, where she means, let's say, S is an apt target for the reactive attitudes if and only if, and then she fills in conditions. You could have lots of different ways of doing that. I mean, I like to do it in terms of acting from your own reasons responsive mechanism. Harry Frankfurt talks about, a mesh between your second order volition and your action. Gary Watson talks about a relationship between your values and the mental states that motivate you. And libertarians talk about, let's say, either certain kinds of self-forming actions that are in a indeterministic context, or agent causation, or whatever, but we all give different accounts. So what I think is going on is the normative, the metaphysical account. If you look at the right side of the biconditional, that is, if you say, agent S is morally responsible if and only if, and then you fill in a number of conditions. If those conditions do not have normative notions like maybe fairness or those kinds of normative notions in them, then if it does have those notions, then it's a normative account. If it doesn't, then it's a metaphysical account. Does that?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. You said before the Strawsonian concept, but you meant conception, right? Because the Strawsonian isn't a separate concept, it's a conception.
Sorry, but what I think of the Strawsonian view as an attempt to say what the concept of moral responsibility is, yeah. But I then think, right, he has also a sketch of a conception of responsibility. So his concept is, in my view, either the actual targeting of individuals with the reactive attitudes, or if you want to say, what is it for an individual to be responsible? Either on the stronger interpretation, you'd say she is the actual target of a reactive attitude in a culture, or on the other interpretation, you'd say she's an apt target for the reactive attitudes. okay, that is what it is to be responsible. That's the concept of responsibility. But now his conception is, so, okay, if you ask when exactly do we apply that concept to an individual, it has to do with her quality of will. So the quality of will idea is part of his conception of responsibility, and it's essentially then a normative notion, because he's not saying an agent is morally responsible if and only if, and that, you know, he acts from a certain kind of, he exhibits a kind of control and so forth. He's saying on the right-hand side of the biconditional is something normative about the quality of will. Now, Matt raises an interesting question, and he says, well, he asks, but wait a second, can you really have hostility or to someone or have a negative quality of will if you haven't formed that through a process under which you had control, of which you had control, and that would bring them together and make the distinction really hard.
But I agree with Matt, but I think you could still say it's a normative approach he makes, because it seems like the control is sort of secondary to the expression of ill will. What matters is that you express an ill will, but when you think about how can you express an ill will, you realize that you can't really do that if you're completely out of control.
Yeah, that is, I guess, I'll get to you in just a second or two. I guess that is correct. Upon reflection, you could say, even if having the relevant quality of will requires control, it still is a normative conception, because it doesn't just require control, it involves this normative dimension or element, the quality, either hostility or indifference. If that hostility had to be in place through a metaphysics, what that would at least show is that it's not a, as it were, purely normative account. It also has elements of metaphysics in it, and I think various people want to interpret Strawson that way. Okay, Artum.
Well, I think that look at Strawson's article. He doesn't talk about occurrence, situation. He's talking about considerations, and probably Strawson would answer that look, there is no metaphysical condition of control. The person must be considered to have control over his actions, and this consideration of control might be not a metaphysical thing.
Yeah, well, he definitely says we don't have to see the agent as meeting some kind of metaphysical condition in order to consider the agent as responsible. He definitely says that. So on the interpretation which suggests that in order to have the quality of will in virtue of which someone is responsible, she has to have formed that will, that quality of will, via a process that involved control. It does seem in tension, I think, with Strawson's claim that the individual doesn't have to meet some metaphysical condition, because it suggests that he does. So, I don't know.
What I want to say is, my point is that Strawson could say that this condition of control, it might be like conventional thing. So it's also a piece of this attitudes network. We regard the person as having control,
right?
And this is not a metaphysical.
Yeah. So that, well, it does raise good point. It raises the question: what he means by a metaphysical condition. I've read him as meaning that it's some kind of control or freedom condition. But what you're suggesting is maybe it's something else. Maybe you could have as it were, conventional notion of control that's not, in the relevant sense, metaphysical. But I'm not sure about that. Okay, Dimitri and Sophia.
Yeah, just a very basic question.
Yeah.
Why is he concentrating on resentment? He does mention, other emotions like gratitude. He focuses on resentment in the first part, and I think he focuses on indignation in the second part.
Yeah, right.
And he also says that resentment is of special interest.
Yeah.
But maybe I overlooked something. Maybe everybody knows the answer.
No.
Why is this in the center?
Right.
Part of it is the traditional interest in blame. I mean, you have people who talk about moral responsibility say praise or blame, then they go on to talk about blame.
Okay.
Why is that? Well, Gary Watson says, well, because there's a lot more at stake in blame. I mean, if I mistakenly praise you, that might be in some sense unfair, but you probably don't mind. Whereas if I inappropriately blame you, then you're potentially open to injury. It's going to be a big problem for you. So there's a burden on me to make sure that my blame is accurate. So maybe we have an interest in theorizing more about blame than we do about praise. I mean, that's probably part of it, right? But I also think resentment is a kind of placeholder for a whole range of negative reactive attitudes. It's just the one word that he focuses on for the interpersonal or the sort of first personal negative reactive attitude.
Yeah. I think there's something similar, very similar with regard to punishment. I mean, we focus in philosophy a lot of attention on punishment, different theories of punishment and so forth. We don't talk much about moral reward, you know, when reward is appropriate. But again, I mean, I think you could say that it's partly because much more is at stake. If I wrongly or mistakenly or inappropriately punish you, I've inflicted some, you know, some damage on you or some harsh treatment, but if if it's inappropriate, you know, that's really a problem. If I inappropriately reward you, it's not such a big deal. I mean, I've done something, you know, that's benefited you inappropriately, but we don't care so much with it. So I think that may be why he focuses so much on indignation. Do you remember, where does he actually say
indignation?
Yeah, at the first point that's what he's going to...
Relatively late.
Because that's what he does focus on. And remember,
resentment or indignation?
No, I'm sorry, resentment.
Oh.
Resentment. No, so remember, he distinguishes an attitude like resentment. And so if I resent, I can resent Yishai for something he did to me. Like Yishai, let's say Yishai says something really mean about my book, Responsibility and Control. No, right, but let's say he did. I can resent him because it's something he did to me. But let's say Yishai says something really, really mean about a book that Vadim has written, then, you know, it's not that I can't resent Yishai. I can be indignant on behalf of Vadim, but I can't resent. So there are two different kinds of attitudes. The latter is called, indignation is a vicarious reactive attitude on behalf of someone else who's been targeted inappropriately, perhaps. Okay, but then where did he first?
Beginning of section 3.
Yeah, right, 66. It's the first time you see resentment. He sort of lists gratitude, resentment, forgiveness, love, hurt feelings.
But does he say why? Does he even say why he's going to focus on? Okay. Yeah, resentment definitely is central here, and indignation. And I think one plausible explanation is that just so much more is at stake that we really worry about inflicting a harsh treatment on people and pain when they don't deserve it. We don't so much worry about giving people benefits that they don't deserve. Maybe that's part of it.
What about another just definitional question, and maybe also a very simple answer? Why does he start with, I mean, I'm used to the topography of different approaches to moral responsibility, where there's there's compatibilists, incompatibilists, you know, libertarians, and you know, hard incompatibilists.
Yes,
and,
right.
He starts with something different. He starts with optimists, pessimists, and skeptics. Again, what's the point?
Well, one thing is this was written in 1962. A lot of the terminology kind of has developed since then, but even so, this is a little quirky. Basically, I think what he means by optimist is compatibilist. For him, an optimist is a compatibilist.
It's a consequentialist compatibilist.
Yeah, well, it's also consequentialist.
It's a species of compatibilism. Okay, right. It's a consequent. It's a forward-looking kind of, but it is a compatibilist. And then a pessimist, obviously, is an incompatibilist. And in the end, Strawson starts with the view. He says. He's not really sure what causal determinism is, what the thesis of causal determinism is. It's unclear to him. But he does think that whatever it is, it's compatible with moral responsibility. So he is a compatible. So he, in his terms, I suppose, he's an optimist, but not a consequentialist optimist. He's a compatibilist. I don't know. I agree. The terminology is a bit confusing, or it's a little idiosyncratic. But the way to map it on, an optimist is a certain kind of compatibilist, and a pessimist is an incompatibilist. And he ends up arguing for compatibilism because his argument is really beautiful in a sense, and that is, he looks very carefully at our responsibility practices, and he notes the conditions under which we would either, as he puts it, mollify or eliminate our reactive attitudes. And he argues that causal determinism in itself does not entail the conditions under which we would mollify or adjust or eliminate the reactive attitudes. So causal determinism, he thinks, is compatible with moral responsibility. Yep.
Do you know when the word compatible, because I feel Dimitri's sort of vexation about this. It would be much more helpful if he used the traditional terminology. Do you know when the word compatibilist came about? He uses the word libertarian.
Right.
But he doesn't.
Yeah, he does use ones. Yeah.
Right. But so does this predate?
It might. I don't honestly know when the word came in. There was recently on the Flickers of Freedom blog, did you see this discussion of when the word incompatibilist came into to use? And it was shockingly recently. I don't even remember specifically, but so it may be that this, I mean, this was 1962, and it antedated a lot of the kind of active discussion of these issues, so yeah.
And the skeptic is...
A skeptic, I think a moral responsibility skeptic, I would define a skeptic as someone who doesn't believe that we have moral responsibility. And someone...
And this is like hard incompatible?
Well, that, is one view. I mean, that's Pereboom's moral skepticism. There are other versions of it, or other ways to get to it. I mean, specifically, Pereboom is a skeptic about responsibility understood as involving basic desert. But he does think we can, as we'll see, preserve many of our responsibility practices. We could still have love and blame and, lots of our responsibility practices. It's just that they can't presuppose basic desert. So he is a skeptic, but I mean, I should say other moral responsibility skeptics don't think we can keep any of our responsibility practices. They think we should just shift to positive and negative reinforcement. So there are different versions.
So Rosen is a skeptic, according to Strawson. Rosen as well, right?
Who?
Rosen.
Rosen?
Gideon.
Oh, Gideon Rosen. Yes. Oh, yes. Sorry. Yeah, he is. I thought you said according to Strawson.
Yeah.
Oh, according to his terminology. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was worried about time travel there. Yeah. Right. Okay. Yes. Right. I think yes. Yusha.
I had a question.
Be careful. I might resent you for this.
I had a question that goes back to the metaphysical normative distinction.
Yeah.
We can move on.
No, that's okay. Go ahead. It's a really tough thing, but it's good to think about it.
Yeah. So I think we were considering the possibility that exhibiting a suitable quality of will itself requires a certain kind of control.
Yeah.
But that this account of responsibility is still a normative account because there's a normative part. Yeah,
that's what I think Matt would suggest.
Yeah.
But all I was saying is that that's at least somewhat in tension with the idea that Strawson states that in order to consider someone responsible, we don't have to see him or her as meeting some metaphysical condition. Okay, but anyway, it's at least somewhat in tension with that, but yeah, okay.
But then when I think about any account of responsibility, it seems like there will be some normative elements to any account, because the agent has to knowingly perform the wrong action or something along those lines. So it seems like at best we're going to have a spectrum of views that incorporate both. I mean, assuming that even the exhibiting suitable quality of will condition has some metaphysical component to it, then really there's just going to be this spectrum of accounts of responsibility where there's more of an emphasis on, well, not more of an emphasis, but there are more and less robust kinds of control that are required.
Well, good. Okay, let me just suggest. So it is really tricky, but it might be. So I'm not sure that you need a notion like rightness or wrongness in the analysis or specification of the conception of responsibility. Now, if you're trying to give an account of blameworthiness, you might need wrongness. So S is blameworthy if and only for his action, if and only if his action was wrong. I mean, this is just very rough, and blah, 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 so you have that. But now, moral responsibility, I don't think would require that. So the agent S is morally responsible for Fying if and only if, and now you don't have to say Fying was right or wrong, in my view. You just say, in my view, Fying issued from the agent's own moderately reasons responsive mechanism. Or, you know, on the different accounts, you could say Fying, the agent identified with Phi in the sense that, you know, he formed a second-order volition to act in accordance with his first-order desire to Phi. But there's no explicit normative element there. Okay. Okay, go ahead. So do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, because I had a hand up about, I wanted to add something too about this control condition, because for everything that Strawson says, it doesn't seem like you think that you need to have some particular control in how your ill will came about. Okay. So your ill will, I suppose, could have come from anywhere, as long as now you are the kind of person with whom you can have normal adult relationships, right, and the ill will fits into that. Right. But I think there has to be some kind of control over the action. The action has to issue from the ill will in the right way, otherwise the action doesn't express the ill will. Okay. I also think that's why you bring in alternatives, because if you lack alternatives in a certain compatibilist sense, then your action don't really express anything. If in a certain compatibilist sense your options are narrowed down to just one road, then your action no longer expresses anything.
Yeah, well, that would be controversial, though. I would want to say you could express...
Yeah, possibly, but I think that's what he means with alternatives. Okay, it's all about your action flowing from your ill will rather than being forced upon you.
Right, okay.
I would add that I think that that's what Strawson should say. He should not have any historical component to whether or not your actions express ill will. But he does have the bit where when he's talking about exempting conditions, he says maybe he had a really unfortunate childhood. And he doesn't justify that at all. He doesn't explain what he means, but he says maybe if somebody had a really unfortunate childhood, I can't predict the exact wording, but essentially it's a very unfortunate childhood, then we shouldn't...
Maybe he means that your bad childhood made you a bit irrational.
I think that's probably what he means, right? So it's not just having had a bad childhood that exempts you, and we should probably talk about excusing and exempting conditions, but it's not just having had a bad childhood that makes you an inappropriate target for resentment. It's probably bad childhood makes you now sort of incapable of control or irrational or something like that, and that makes you an illegitimate target for resentment and indignation.
Okay, Nan?
Oh, so if anyone else has anything to say about this, I have a question that actually goes a little bit back to what Artem was talking about earlier.
Okay, let me finish then. I just quickly... Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Oksana.
Maybe it's strange, but you encourage to ask strange questions.
No, I encourage you to ask stupid questions, not strange questions.
Oh.
No, it's okay. Strange is fine. Okay.
Maybe not stupid, I'm not sure. But
I welcome strange questions. Okay.
If reactive attitude takes at least will, then I'm not sure whether we can use a strong interpretation of moral responsibility as just targeting, because I could get extremely angry at, say, a hat which fall from a wardrobe. Why not? Then would be morally responsible in such a strong interpretation.
Right. I agree. I mean,
is such an interpretation actually possible?
Well, that's a good. That's kind of an extreme case of what Mark Revisa and I were worried about in the introduction to our 1993 anthology. So I don't know if everyone heard it, but someone might be very angry at a hat that falls, in his wardrobe, and resented, I suppose, but targeted with anger and resentment, and that seems clearly inappropriate. So it on the strong interpretation, you'd say the hat is morally responsible for falling. So it really can't be. Now, of course, you have to interpret him, I guess, a little more charitably. There may be more charitable ways of reading. You might say, well, it has to be a conscious agent in the first place, but then you still have conscious agents who are severely impaired, and it would seem, so that's why I thought the aptness move is a charitable and probably, yeah, helpful way of understanding Strawson. But then the aptness could be understood either, as it were, metaphysically or normatively, or maybe both. But here, let me give you, Dmitry. Yep.
Just to add to this, there's a book called Criminal Persecution and Capital Punishments of Animals, which has, and also Inanimate Objects is a book about medieval practices of this, and they used to punish sculptures and insects that actually killed the crops. Yeah. So the whole village would, it's not like insane people. Yeah. It would be the whole village conducting this big tribunal over the insects that killed the...
So it might
so that was the I guess that was, according to Strawson, they were appropriate targets of resentment and
or one way of thinking about it is, well, if a culture does target sculptures, you know, morally blames sculptures and targets them with indignation or resentment in certain contexts, then you could say, on the strong interpretation, in that, relative to that culture, they are deeming the sculpture as morally responsible, and in fact, the sculpture is morally responsible because relative to that culture, in that culture, the sculpture is morally responsible, or the hat is morally responsible. And maybe, you know, I can see that's not obviously wrong. I mean, if you're trying to give an account of what responsibility is, maybe that culture is deeming sculptures responsible. It's a little more of a stretch to say, in that culture, statues are actually responsible. That's, you know, we wanted to move away from that and go to the aptness idea. But in any case, it seems to be a problem that there's no room for stepping back from the actual practice and criticizing it. You know, if someone targets a hat that doesn't fall or whatever, I mean, I don't know, or a sculpture that's a perfectly, I mean, it's just arbitrary and given what gets targeted. There's no further basis at all, metaphysical or normative, and that seems problematic. That seems problematic. But yeah, that's interesting. But here, let me give you an example. Maybe this helps a little of what a distinction between a normative and a, on one conception of this distinction and a metaphysical conception. Here, someone like, let's distinguish J. Wallace's account from let's say an account like Frankfurt's or mine. So Wallace says, and this is again rough and ready, but see, S is morally responsible for lying, if and only if, and then we're looking, you know, how people fill in these blanks, and it's basically, it would be fair to hold S responsible for buying. Okay, so here, this is a good example of a normative approach in the sense that I've sketched. I mean, S is morally responsible for buying if and only if, and then on the right side of the biconditional, there's some essentially normative notion. It would be fair to hold S responsible for fine. Now, you know, if you compare this with someone like Frankfurt, it's different. I mean, in some interesting way. I mean, S is morally responsible for fying if and only if. And now, how does he fill it in? Well, something like S identifies, oops, I'm sorry, I can't, that wasn't very clear. S identifies with fying, i.e., if and only if S acts from a first-order desire desire in accord with S's second order volition. Something like that. The agent has formed a second order volition, which is a second order desire to act on a particular first order desire. So I'm just suggesting, if you look at Wallace, on the right side of the biconditional, there's something explicitly normative. If you look at Frankfurt, on the right side of the biconditional, there's nothing explicitly normative. Now, if you thought that, I'll get to you in a second, if you thought that in order to be responsible, the reflection that issues in the second order volition would have to be based on morality or rationality or something normative, then that would transform this into a normative account. But Frankfurt's very explicit that you could form this second order volition based on a whim or a caprice or nothing having to do with morality at all. It's just your way of identifying. So anyway, this kind of is a way of laying out the map. I mean, now, it's hard though. I mean, it's just really hard because I want to say S is morally responsible if and only if S meets the all this, there's an epistemic condition embedded in all these, but then the agent acts from his own reasons responsive mechanism. Well, reasons are a normative notion. So does that put me on the normative side? I'm not sure. Yep.
So Wallace's view is explicitly Strawsonian.
Yes.
You know, he says he's developing a Strawsonian view. But the second, he's going to say more than that on the second side of the biconditional. He's going to say, well, what makes it fair to hold somebody responsible is that she has capacities of reflective self-control.
Yes.
And his account of reflective self-control is not nearly as sophisticated as, but is similar to your notion of moderate reason responsiveness.
Yes.
And you're also going to have a notion of fairness that's at least implicit in your account. I mean, you think it's fair to target somebody with negative reactive attitudes if they're moderately reasonable responsiveness, right? You don't believe in blaming people unfairly, obviously. So there is normativity in yours as well.
No, okay, so again, there's a bunch of complexity here that we probably but this is all fair. And what I wanted to point out, yes, you're right, that that's why I said this is really oversimplified, but this is the first idea.
It's explicit in a way.
It would be fair to hold S responsible, but what he wants to say further is S is morally responsible for fying if and only if S acts with, not necessarily from, but with a general capacity to understand reasons, grasp reasons, and conform one's behavior to reason, some sort of general capacity for reasons responsiveness. So it's explicit that reasons responsiveness are acting from this, acting while possessing this general capacity is a kind of explanation of the conditions under which it would be fair to hold us as responsible. And I don't, in my account, I talk about reasons responsiveness, but it's not explicit that it has to do with fairness. But what went into the formulation of these conditions are intuitions about fairness. So, okay, I don't know how much more we want to go into this distinction between metaphysical and normative. I started by saying it's really difficult to make the distinction, and it's unclear what it amounts to, and in different theories, it's used differently. So I still think that's right. I'm not sure that I have an adequate account of the distinction. Okay, was there someone else who... Okay, so how are we doing on time? I've got about half hour before our coffee break. Let's go through, I just want to make a couple more points and we can discuss them about his overall strategy. So as you know, he says, the optimists, which are, as Sophia pointed out, compatibilists of a certain sort, consequentialist compatibilists, they point to the efficacy of the responsibility practices in regulating behavior, and that's all they think is required for responsibility. Pessimists point out that this isn't sufficient, the mere efficacy of the practices in regulating behavior. That all that really gives you is positive and negative reinforcement, and that's not conditioning, that's treating people or training them like you might train an animal, but it's not specifically punishment. Punishment involves at least some notion of guilt, and what the pessimist further points out is that, or believes, is that guilt presupposes the lack of determinism. So there's a kind of, the pessimists insist that in order to have guilt, you can't be determined to behave the way you are. Pessimists emphasize the desert of the reactive attitudes, not just the regulation of behavior, and the insufficiency of efficacy points to a gap or lacuna in the optimist position. So there's this gap in the optimist position that has to be filled in. The pessimist fills it in a way that Strawson thinks is too strong. It's too strong to require indeterminism. So what he wants to do is figure out what more an optimist can say in order to kind of resolve this debate between the optimists and pessimists. What more than just mere regulation that falls short of saying that we need indeterminism? Because Strawson thinks that we don't need indeterminism. It doesn't have any, it's not required by our practices at all. And here is where Strawson just points to the rich texture of our interpersonal relationships and contends that the reactive attitudes are essential to these personal relationships. He wants to remind us that, what it's like to be in human interpersonal relationships that involve friendship and collaboration and love. What he claims is those are central to our lives, incredibly meaningful and important, and he further argues that the reactive attitudes are essential to, they're kind of like the glue that hold these interpersonal relationships together. Okay, and so what he wants to say is the optimist needs to embrace, to extend the notion, his conception of responsibility to include not just changing people's behavior, but this rich texture of reactive attitudes that hold together our interpersonal relationships. And he thinks this concession on the part of the optimist, the concession is that it's not just regulating behavior, but it's the reactive attitudes that hold together our interpersonal relationship. That concession should lead to or elicit a concession on the part of the pessimist, and that is that a freedom inconsistent with determinism is not required for responsibility. Because if what you are doing is focusing on our actual practices of targeting ourselves and others with reactive attitudes, you'll see that nothing in these practices requires indeterminism. Okay, and interestingly, he gives a character. I mean, I think this is a beautiful part of the paper. Is he says, let's look carefully at our reactive attitudes, our practices of, as he says, withholding or mollifying the reactive attitudes. And what you'll see is there are two subgroups of situations. One subgroup is where it indicates the individual is not an agent at all, or it doesn't have the capacities for moral responsibility at all. So Strawson, Peter Strawson, his son Galen is also writing about these issues. So when do we, oops, I didn't put space there. When do we mollify or withhold reactive attitudes? Now it's a picture like this, two subgroups. One is conditions in which there's no agency or of relevant sort, no agency of relevant sort, or you might say, i.e., lack of general capacities required for that kind of agency. Now, here, the second subgroup, agency is present of this sort, but agent not fully responsible or not responsible in circumstances. And then what's interesting is there are two subgroups here. So I just wanted to make sure you see, it can be confusing. He starts with two subgroups, and then there are two subgroups within the second subgroup. Okay? And so here, let me just say, it's on 60, well, let me just get it. 68 and 69, and then 70 and 71. So in the first subgroup there on the left, the agent still has the general capacities associated with the relevant kind of agency. And so we can look at page 68 really quickly. Here it is. It's kind of in the middle of the first full, or I'm sorry, about a third of the way down the first full paragraph. To the first group belong all those which might give occasion for the employment of such expressions as he didn't mean to, he hadn't realized, he didn't know, and all those which might give occasion for the use of the phrase he couldn't help it. When this is supported by such phrases as he was pushed, he had to do it, it was the only way, they left no alternative, etc. Obviously, these pleas and the kinds of situations in which they would be appropriate differ from each other in striking and important ways, but for my purpose they have something still more important in common. None of them invites us to suspend toward the agent, either at the time of his action or in general, our ordinary reactive attitudes. They do not invite us to view the agent as one in respect of whom these attitudes are in any way inappropriate. They invite us to view the injury as one in respect of which a particular one of these attitudes is inappropriate. So the agent's general capacities are still present. There's something else going on. But now at the bottom of the page, he says, so that's the group, the first group on the left. Now the second subgroup is very different. Then he says, I shall take them in two subgroups, of which the first is far less important than the second. So in the first subgroup, we may think of such statements as he wasn't himself, he's been under very great strain recently, he was acting under post-hypnotic suggestion, and then in the connection, in connection with the second, we may think of he's only a child, he's a hopeless schizophrenic, his mind has been systematically perverted. So, you know, being a hopeless schizophrenic or having your mind systematically perverted, maybe by manipulation or some indoctrination or certain kinds of upbringing, he thinks would indicate that the individual doesn't even have the general capacities relevant for agency at all. Okay, so there's an interesting and subtle discussion of this, but what in Strawson. But what's really important is this move that he makes. He says, causal determinism, even though he doesn't understand exactly what the doctrine is, he knows enough about it to think causal determinism would not in itself entail that for every piece of behavior of every human being, at least one of these conditions is present. That is, it's not going, causal determinism isn't going to entail that she was pushed, she had no, you know, well, let me say, she's a hopeless schizophrenic, she's, you know, had certain kind of manipulation. Those are, you could say, special cases. Those indicate a certain kind of causation, but causal determinism in itself does not entail that every action is produced in one of these exculpating ways, or one of these ways that remove or diminish or, you know, mollify, or would cause us to modify our reactive attitude. And that's really the beautiful argument, I think, an important argument. Okay, let me stop there. Is there Are there comments about this? Yeah, Dan.
So he keeps on using this term invite with respect to these two groups. So in the first one he says, under what I think Watson calls them the excusing conditions and the exempting conditions.
Yeah.
Under the excusing conditions he says, you know, they invite us to see the action or the injury as something which, you know, with respect to which the reactive attitudes would be inappropriate. And then the second sort of says they invite us to see the agent either temporarily or permanently as someone whom the reactive attitudes are inappropriate.
Yeah.
But then he also talks about, in terms of not just invitation, but what would actually tend to mollify or mitigate or eliminate our reactive attitudes.
Yeah.
So there's this talk of what they invite us to do, what actually happens to us. And then there's also this really sort of shifty talk about what would or what we would think would be appropriate, what would seem appropriate. I'm wondering, is this a problem for him? It seems like it's not clear whether he's offering a merely descriptive account of what actually happens to us, or whether he's offering a more normative account of how we ought to respond, even if it's only in light of our, you know, our own sort of internal norms. Or is it just that he's not being clear about what he's saying? Is he saying, you know, according to your own light, you shouldn't blame? Or is he saying, this is the sort of thing that would make you probably not blame the person?
Good. What do you think, others? I mean, I'm inclined to think here he's just describing our practices. He's just trying to, he's describing and systematizing, seeking to kind of understand the deep structure of our actual practices. And I'm not sure that he's saying this is the way we ought to look at things, but he's saying this is the way we actually look at things. And given that, you can see that causal determinism, no matter what it is specifically, causal determinism doesn't imply that for every bit of behavior there's going to be one of our ordinary excusing or exempting conditions. Causal determinism does not entail that we're all manipulated or that we're all hopeless schizophrenics or all of these conditions. So causal determinism in itself wouldn't rule out being an apt target of reactive attitude. But I'm not sure. I mean, you're right. This article is incredibly rich and brilliant. It's a brilliant article, but it's also, it's very difficult to pin him down, very coy, maybe shifty is a fair term. Okay, R2?
I want to respond to Dan. I think that descriptive interpretation of Strawson is the only consistent interpretation of this article. If we start to interpret it in a normative way, his arguments doesn't work. And look at what he says. What these groups include? What are the objects classified? So that there are considerations, not situations, not occurrences, not circumstances, but only descriptions of what we would say in that situation. But if we interpret this article only in a descriptive way, also these arguments, they are valid. They lose a lot of their persuasive power. They can't lead to these strong conclusions that Strawson.
Okay, good.
I think that when I read this paper, I usually think it looks like some kind of meta-ethical expressivism, but then occasionally it looks like something else. It looks like some kind of meta-ethical naturalism where moral facts just are psychological facts. So I think it's a bit like a duck rabbit picture in that way, I think, to me at least.
It is very, well, the whole paper is very difficult and duck rabbitish. I mean, by the way, when there was the introductory philosophy book that John Perry and Michael Bratman edited for many years with Oxford Press included the Peter Strawson paper, and then when they invited me to be the third editor, and I then had to do all the work of selecting the new papers and everything, which was fair because I was getting some of the royalties and they had built it up. So I decided to eliminate the Strawson paper, and they said, wait a second, this is a very important paper. And I said, yes, it's a very important paper, but not suitable for an introductory book because it's so difficult. And I think it really is difficult, and yet it's highly suggestive. And I mean, one thing that is, I think, a beautiful idea, an important idea, is if you look carefully at our practices, nothing in our practices shows that determinism in itself would render people not apt candidates of reactive attitudes, because determinism doesn't entail that every one of us meets one of these specific conditions. Now, and if those are the conditions that we think rule out responsibility, then determinism in itself wouldn't do that. I think there's an important book in contemporary philosophy by J. Wallace developing this idea with more, perhaps a certain kind of rigor and clarity that's lacking in Strawson. But one of the things that Wallace looks at is whether you can generalize from our practices to the principle of alternative possibilities. That is, if you look carefully at our practices of giving these kinds of exemptions and excuses, or withholding or mollifying the reactive attitudes under all these specific circumstances, could you generalize from those to the claim that moral responsibility requires freedom to do otherwise? And what he argues is that in a Strawsonian way, no, our actual practices don't generalize to the principle of alternative possibilities. There are other more plausible explanations of these practices. Of course, if these practices did in some way rest on the principle of alternative possibilities, then that would really raise an important problem for Strawson, because if determinism rules out alternative possibilities, then there would be some reason to think determinism is incompatible with responsibility. But what Wallace argues is, you know, the so-called generalization strategy fails. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't work. Yeah, Sophia.
Yeah, I just realized another thing. I mean, this whole idea that you can't step outside of a practice and evaluate it from outside. I think this may not be completely true, but let's not go into that and just assume that it's true. In that case, you can't evaluate morality from a non-moral standpoint, and that seems fairly plausible to me. But it might still be possible to evaluate the practice of moral responsibility from a moral standpoint, which isn't concerned with responsibility, and that's basically what Peerbohm does, I think. But maybe Strawson and certain other philosophers conceive of moral responsibility not as like a sub-part of morality, but as sort of coextensive with morality as a whole. It almost seems like it, because Peerbohm evaluates this basic desert moral responsibility from another place in morality. But Strawson seems to think that moral responsibility is something that sort of permeates all of morality, and that's why you can't step outside.
Yeah, that's a good, interesting point. And I think we should, it raises this point that I did want to bring to your attention, whether Strawson is correct in general that you can't step outside of a framework and ask for an assessment of it or a justification of it from outside the framework. That's kind of maybe a catchy, trendy thing to say in some ways, but is it really true? And so that's the first question. But so right, I mean, often philosophers, going back at least to Plato, ask the question, can we justify or explain morality in terms of something more basic like rationality or prudence? I think that was what the Republic was all about. That's what Aristotle was also wondering. Does justice pay?
Immanuel Kant explains it in terms of rationality.
Yes, Kant wants to explain morality in terms of rationality. So it seems like in some sense you can step out of one framework and ask for a justification in terms of another. But now, if you think of normativity, broadly speaking, as including morality, rationality, all these different concerns, maybe it's harder to imagine stepping outside. But then the question is, what is going on in the responsibility literature when people think freedom is something that, as it were, is required or presupposed by or justifies our responsibility practices, is that really like completely stepping out of our one framework, or is it evaluating parts of one framework in terms of other parts? You know, so I think what you're raising, it's a perfectly good question about Strawson's claim here. But okay, Dimitri?
Yeah, but that sounds false to me, because you can clearly justify the existence of altruism from the evolutionary biology.
Right.
So you can clearly step out of morality discourse and go to like biology. Otherwise, it's just going to hang as a miracle.
Yeah, or you could seek to. I mean, I think it's complex because it might be that in seeking to justify morality through biology, you might be sneaking in some moral notions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can give a biological explanation, a causal explanation, but would that be a moral justification of
Yeah,
that would be a causal explanation. Wouldn't that be a step outside of the practice? Yeah, it would be, right?
Yeah, and so, but you know, again,
that's probably so I'm misunderstanding something. That's not a
justification.
Okay.
Yeah, so it will have to have normative. So it is at least plausible that you could justify one normative notion in terms of another normative notion, like morality in terms of rationality, but it's less plausible that you could step out of normativity entirely in giving it justification. But then, how does that point relate to this specific debate, and how Strawson wants to apply it? That's an interesting question. Yes, Simon.
So I had a question about you said that Wallace develops the argument about not requiring, the causal determinism doesn't produce the threat, and the generalization from.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering why, because presumably people who think that causal determinism is a threat don't think that it comes from any kind of consideration that might undermine responsibility. Only some of them are going to be the same kind of condition that might lead you to think that causal determinism is a problem. So it's not like you would have to find something that can account for all types of excuses or exempting conditions. It's just, right, so the kind of conditions he lists where someone had to do it or it was the only way, it was pushed, they're the kinds of conditions that are going to lead one to think that causal determinism problem.
Right.
You've got the inevitability.
Right. So that's a good point.
The generalization, Wallace's, so he calls it the generalization strategy, and the idea is it's similar to what Strawson's saying, right? That determinism, the truth of determinism wouldn't mean that it was a general condition that everyone was pushed, that nobody knew what they were doing. So the idea is that none of those, determinism wouldn't mean that any one of those individual conditions it generalizes.
Yeah, but the way I put it may be a little bit misleading, is a little different from the way Matt did, but let's put it this way, that, and I'd have to go back to Wallace to remind myself of exactly what he was saying, but at least part of what he was saying was that nothing in our practices, as they actually are, imply that moral responsibility requires alternative possibilities or requires freedom to do otherwise. And so he wants to look at those, and so you're right, and we'll come back to this, I promise you, when we read my paper, comparing my approach and Strawson's, but when you look at some of the conditions, I forget exactly which rubric they're under, but he was pushed, he had no alternative to doing what he did, he had to do what he did. Those suggest that when an agent can't do otherwise, he's not responsible, in which case you would be back in the debates about the relationship between determinism and freedom to do otherwise. What Strawson, I think, must hold, and what Wallace does explicitly hold, is you could understand those conditions and how they work, those pleas and how they work, without generalizing to a principle of alternative possibility. But you're right. I think you're right that maybe I mischaracterized it. I didn't mean to say that all of these pleas have behind them could have done otherwise. No, but at least you're right. All you need, all the incompatibilists would need is that some of them do presuppose could have done otherwise, and then if determinism rules out could have done otherwise, then you can't explain our practices adequately in a deterministic world. But I think the reply by Wallace would be none of the practices.
Right.
Okay, that's a good point. Angelina?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a clarification question about two subgroups. I didn't get the difference between them. I mean, because in the first one, the first subgroup, he said about a child. He's only a child. And in the second subgroup, there's also talk about the same thing. The second and more important subgroup of cases allows that the circumstances were normal, but presents the agent is psychologically abnormal or morally undeveloped. The agent was himself, but he is warped or deranged, neurotic, or just a child.
Look at the bottom of 68, the second line. She's talking about
the two subgroups I think should be under no agency. Is that right?
Well, so we got type 1, but type 2. You're talking about you're talking about the second bifurcation.
Subgroups.
The second at the bottom of 68, the first subgroup of the second subgroup is he wasn't himself. So if you look at right at the bottom of the second, the last line, that's the first subgroup, and the second subgroup is he was only a child. He was schizophrenic.
But those are the two subgroups of the no agency.
Yes.
Right?
No. So we got here what Watson introduces. So this is type 1. This is type 2.
Yeah.
These Watson later on will call excusing conditions. These are exempting conditions.
I think the way that it's
switched.
So lack of general capacity is required. Those should be under the no agency.
So saying no agency is a little odd. So excusing conditions are in a way no agency conditions. You were pushed. You weren't exercising your agency. So it's not appropriate for me to resent you. You know, you bump into me. I turn around and I'm ready to resent you. But then I realized that you were shoved. Okay, you didn't have the right kind of agency.
No,
for me to
it's the
resent
subgroups. It's the subgroups within the second group.
Right,
it's the difference between these two.
Yeah, so this is type 1 of the second subgroup, and this is type 2. So that's at the bottom of 68. He wasn't himself. You were under a lot. So you come in. You're normally a nice person. We get along well. You come into work, and you're really rude and unpleasant. And then I find out that your dog just died. And I say, oh, okay, she was under a lot of stress. I really shouldn't blame her. Strawson says, don't blame her for the person.
No, but wait a minute. I actually think this is a problem in Strawson that Angelica points out.
It might be.
He mentions being a child both here and here, and maybe that's just a mistake of him. But he says being a child here as well as here, actually.
He doesn't.
He doesn't?
Right? No, he doesn't.
In connection with so we got in the first, so 68, the last sentence. In connection with the first,
68 last.
No.
we may think of such statements as he wasn't himself, he's been under great strain, he was acting under post-hypnotic suggestion. In the second, we may think he's only a child, he's a hopeless schizophrenic, he was perverted. That's compulsive behavior.
Yeah, but look here, on page 69, at the very top of page 69, you got he's only a child in connection with his own.
No, in connection with the second, we may think he's only a
the
child.
first line.
The second subgroup.
Yeah, okay, right, yeah, I misread, okay, and I guess Angelina also misread, but it looked on, I guess, a bit of sloppy reading as if child belonged to both the subgroups.
That's why I actually wrote that little diagram up, because it's very confusing. The way he writes, he's talking about two subgroups and then two subgroups of the second subgroup. Yes.
And he's almost talking about the two subgroups simultaneously.
Right. Yeah, it's very confusing.
So, and actually, if we could do, this is interesting to trace through all of the second subgroups. So in 69, you get only a child, hopeless schizophrenic.
Yeah.
Later on page 70 at the top, you get warped, deranged, compulsive. Later on, and so he just keeps coming back to it. 72, you get mentally deranged or a moral idiot in the middle of 72. Those are all that second subgroup of the second subgroup. And then at some point he gives, later on, even later, he gives the peculiarly unfortunate childhood, which we talked about earlier.
Yeah, but it's really flipping back and forth then between the subgroups that was confused Angelina, then confused me.
Yeah, and I agree that I should have I reversed the order here, didn't I, in my map of presentation? Because the first one that he presents, you do have agency, right?
Yeah, that's my question.
Okay, but yep.
So it sounds like it's really just an epistemic component in the first group. That they have the, I mean, I guess it depends on how we characterize the notion of having the general capacities. But one could have the general capacities to perform some action, and, but they don't know what the action, what the results of the action are.
There is that. You're right. So that would show that that would be if they don't know and they're not culpably ignorant, they may well be not responsible, but they still may have the general capacity for, you know, reasons responsiveness or for forming second-order volitions, whatever it is. So, you know, think of it this way: that various theorists have accounts of what the general capacities are that are required for the relevant kind of agency, for moral responsibility, or for aptness of the reactive attitudes. And someone like Wallace talks about the possession of a general capacity for reasons responsiveness. Mark Ravisa and I talk about the behavior issuing from a general capacity for reasons responsiveness. Frankfurt talks about the general capacity to step back from one's first-order desires and form second-order volitions in virtue of which you identify with your act. Now, some agents are impaired in such a way that they don't have those capacities. They're not reasons responsible. They can't identify reasons, or they can't act in accordance with the reasons they identify, or they can't step back and reflect. So they're in one category of, you know, excuses, or I mean, sorry, of people who are not responsible. But then there are individuals who have those in place, but something else happened. They were pushed, or they were, you know, yeah, okay.
Yeah, but so in the first category, I'm not, I guess I do think that these are probably type 2.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry that, yes, I put the wrong, you may want to change that. Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, I mean, yeah.
Right, so it sounds like in both cases.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
I guess I was thinking under both just main groups, you might think that agency, well, I guess it depends on how we characterize agency. But I mean, like in the first subgroup of the second group, something like he wasn't himself, I guess we could characterize that as an instance of lack of agency, but I'm not sure. So I was thinking more like, well, in the first group, you just have these epistemic conditions that aren't satisfied. And
so this is something like wasn't himself, and these are the only a child, schizophrenic, raised by Nazis, maybe.
Morally undeveloped.
Right.
But does it mean that there is no agency at all?
I think I'm going to misspell schizophrenic if I...
something like that.
Abbreviation. That's probably insensitive.
All right. Well, we're going to come back. Obviously, we're going to work more on this when we discuss Gary Watson's article. But go ahead. Do you have something quickly? Because before we break for coffee, I wanted to remind you of one more important part of his view. But go ahead.
Oh, thanks.
Yep.
I have a doubt this argument would actually work.
Aha. Oh, well, yes, I have a doubt as well. But that's good. Go tell me.
May I just before the break?
Yes, please.
It's a little bit long, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay. Well, try and boil it down.
If I may, right here.
Yeah.
Under your nice name. So there are two possibilities. First, we may interpret his ideas as if he is speaking about our present attitudes, what we have now. And the second possible interpretation, as I guess, is what attitude we could have.
Right.
First idea is we really right now have this approach. That's the situations when we excuse people, right? And then he says, I believe this picture was originally drawn by Dmitri. Am I right? I guess. So there is no implication here from determinism to any of those, right? And that's why we shouldn't care if determinism works, right? But let's think about it. We are talking about the approaches we already have at the moment. Am I right? But we have no idea about determinism, so that doesn't matter at all. Whatever, if determinism is true, if it's not true, we don't know about it. And because of that, we just use our approaches the way we do. Why should we anyway talk about determinism? We shouldn't even mention it here. And if we are talking what would be if we knew if determinism was true, then we could use another picture. It would be different. Here is the approaches we actually have. And then suddenly we know that determinism is true. How to put determinism in our ideas of moral responsibility? We probably could think of some sort of X which implies all of our approaches. We don't hold people responsible in these cases because there is something in common in these cases. And then we could say, all right, but except for these cases, there is also determinism. And this X also imply, not an implication, but determinism as a notion meets the same condition as those things meet with those things have in common. To be such as X, that X is a condition not to hold people responsible. Does it make sense?
Could you go ahead?
Strawson answers this objection. He said that a kind of determinism which might explain all our behavior will not. We cannot find this kind of determinism in each of these cases.
That's right. Determinism in itself does not entail that one of those pleas obtains in every case of human behavior.
Yes, but that has nothing to do with the idea as I do it.
Okay.
I know it sounds weird, but if we are talking about the beliefs we have right now, we shouldn't talk about determinism because that doesn't matter. If we are talking about the beliefs we could adopt if we knew determinism was true, then we should somehow put determinism in our mesh of reality.
He answers that also.
He said that our reactive attitudes cannot be rationally changed. So we can know about determinism from physicists, and this is a rational source of information. And reactive attitudes cannot be impacted by rational argument.
All right, but does something you know influence your attitudes? Even if that's not rational.
Okay, well, let's. Okay, thank you. We will continue to think about that, and we'll come back to some of these issues after the break. But just give me a couple minutes to and then maybe Matt, in his discussion of Gary Watson's paper, will take up this approach too. But there are really, I think, at least two substantive strands of argument in Peter Strawson for compatibilism. The one, I think is the most important one, is the one we've been discussing so far. And that is, if you look carefully at our practices, you'll see that determinism doesn't in itself entail that we always meet one of the conditions for exculpation or, withholding the reactive attitudes. That's an important argument. But another argument is this, as it were, a practical argument. In some sense, he says, either we couldn't or it would be unduly costly to give up our reactive attitudes. And the idea is, as I said, interpersonal relationships like friendship and love and collaboration are extraordinarily important and valuable to us. They help to define who we are as human beings, and the reactive attitudes are essential to those relationships. And thus, we really couldn't give them up without giving something up that helps to define us, that are essential for us. And that then, so even if it turned out that determinism is true, it would be either impossible or prohibitively costly to give up our responsibility practices. So that's this, as it were, practical argument for compatibilism. You see it crystallized or summarized on the bottom of 71, on the top of 72, where he says, a sustained objectivity of interpersonal attitude and the human isolation that would entail does not seem to be something of which human beings would be capable, even if some general truth were a theoretical ground for it. Okay, so the idea is, even if theoretically we felt that, or we realized that if determinism were true, then we couldn't justifiably continue our attitudes, even under that circumstance, it would not be possible for us, or it would be prohibitively costly for us to give up the attitudes. So this is also an important kind of argument that's elicited a lot of critical attention. Okay, so it's an incredibly rich article, and we've only scratched the surface, but we will continue our discussion after the coffee break. So, okay, we're running about 15 minutes late, so I think what we ought to do, let's take, is this okay? Instead of a half hour, we'll just go 25 minutes, and so we'll come back at 20 to the hour? Is that okay? Okay, okay, very good.